There's never been a better time than right now to be a women's wrestler in North America. From WWE, AEW, Impact, and more, women now have plenty of opportunities to shine on a national level. But of course, with this comes an influx of talent, which often makes it difficult for anyone who's not a part of the Four Horsewomen to stand out amongst the pack. Luckily, one woman has figured out the key to doing this, and it's by being unlike any other figure in women's wrestling since Chyna. Yes, at the young age of 26, Rhea Ripley has taken the wrestling world by storm. But how did she get to this point? Join us today as we take a deep dive into her entire career journey so far in Brutality, the Rhea Ripley Story. Demi Bennett was born on October 11, 1996 in Adelaide, South Australia, and it was there she grew up a fan of a number of different sports. But while soccer, karate, and swimming were all big passions for her at school, nothing compared to the thrill she'd get when she went home to watch WWE. To her, the pageantry and athletic talent required to be a star there was on another level entirely. And despite her talents in other areas, she knew by the time she was a teenager, this is what she wanted to do with her future. That said, her biggest inspiration in the industry may come as a surprise to some, because despite the obvious choices for this being people like Chyna or Beth Phoenix, it was actually The Miz who caught her eye the most as a youth. Given how successful Mike Mizanin was at the time, with him even main eventing Wrestlemania at one point, despite being hated by most hardcore fans, perhaps it's no surprise at all that young Adelaide native would see something inspiring in this. After all, she'd had a fair share of struggling to break into the industry herself, as while there was a somewhat thriving indie scene down under at the beginning of the 2010s, it was still difficult for a woman to make an impact there. Bennett's persistence and dedication to get better at her craft every time she stepped inside the ring eventually saw her earn a regular job working for Riot City Wrestling in her home city. And there, making sure she didn't waste the opportunity, over the next 4 years, she'd become a two-time RCW Women's Champion. Of course, that would also open further doors for her because, simultaneous to her run there, the Adelaide native was doing shots over in New Horizon Pro Wrestling and Melbourne City Wrestling, where she got to go up against more established industry names, such as Mercedes Martinez and Saraya Knight, the latter of whom will be better known to most fans as the mother of AEW's Saraya. But those wouldn't be her most memorable opponents while working the Australian indie scene, because outside of that, she'd also get to share the ring on multiple occasions with Kiwi women's performer Evie, better known now as Dakota Kai, and arguably the future Judgment Day members' greatest rival of all, Toni Storm. Yes, as two of the top Aussie women's talents coming up at the same time together, each wanted to prove themselves as being the best. And this is something which would show across their various showdowns together in the mid-2010s. At a certain point, however, their paths would diverge, as Storm began focusing more on her work for Stardom in Japan, where she served as their red belt champion. As this was going on, Bennett continued to plug away on the Australian indies, biding her time and waiting for the opportunity which she knew would eventually come if she just worked hard enough. And that opportunity would finally come, and it happened in the summer of 2017 when the Adelaide native was announced as being amongst the newest class of female signings for WWE. But why was the company signing so many women at one time? Well, with the likes of the Four Horsewomen changing the game for how women were perceived on the main roster, Triple H and William Regal had come up with the idea to cultivate a whole host of new talent by holding the first ever Mae Young Classic. This would take the form of an all-women's knockout tournament where the best indie talent the world had to offer could get a chance to shine on a greater stage. Realizing this was her big break, Bennett formally moved over to the US and reported to NXT, where she'd be renamed Rhea Ripley in preparation for her first-round match. While Ripley easily bested her first-round opponent, Miranda Salinas, she'd end up falling to an all-too-familiar foe named Dakota Kai in the second round. Never one to let a defeat get her down for too long, the Australian picked herself up, dusted herself off, and again she began training for the next year's Mae Young Classic, where she hoped this time to win the whole thing. While she would do a lot better this time around, making it all the way to the semi-finals in fact, in the end, the might of Io Shirai was just too much for her to overcome. So deciding that she maybe needed a new avenue towards stardom, Ripley relocated to the UK, where she became a star attraction on the newly launched NXT UK brand. This turned out to be a great decision for her in the long run, because there she made a quick impact when she defeated her old rival Toni Storm to become not only the inaugural NXT UK Women's Champion, but also the first ever female Australian-born champion in WWE history. Following this major accolade, it should go without saying that Ripley became the undisputed top dog of the British branch of WWE's women's division, with her spending the next few months taking on all comers and knocking them down in short order. It didn't matter if it was Isla Dawn, Deonna Purrazzo, Dakota Kai, or anyone else. In the end, they all fell to the champ. But as with all good things, this run had to come to an end eventually, and so after 139 dominating days, the Adelaide native's time on the top came to its conclusion when at TakeOver Blackpool, she'd lose to none other than Toni Storm. Like Batman and the Joker, it seemed like these two were destined to do this forever, and had she hung around in the UK for much longer, perhaps they would have continued to go through rematch after rematch. As far as Ripley was concerned though, with her no longer having the belt she'd prized so highly, it was time for her to find a new mountain she could climb to the top of. And this mountain turned out to be the main roster. At the WWE's Royal Rumble match of January 2019, the NXT star made a cameo appearance where, in short order, she eliminated 3 people and proved that she was someone to watch in the future. Of course, this wouldn't be her full-time main roster debut though. No, it was only a taste of what was to come, because after whetting fans' appetites for what lay ahead, Ripley returned to NXT UK for a few more months, where she spent her time feuding with, and then eventually teaming up with, Scottish star Piper Niven. The next step in the Aussie's journey took place when she graduated to the main roster of NXT over in Florida that August, with her making yet another quick impact upon her debut by attacking NXT Women's Champion at the time, Shayna Baszler. This was such a big move because back in 2019, Baszler was in the midst of a very lengthy run with the women's title, one so dominating that it felt like she'd never actually lose it. After having defeated Kairi Sane the year prior, the Queen of Spades' reign was about to reach an excess of 400 days, and with no other opponents left for her at this point, the only hope remaining for anyone to take it from her was Rhea Ripley. So, for her first time with WWE, Ripley would turn babyface, with her now being portrayed as the hero coming to save the division rather than the villainous bully she'd been before. And it was this shift in alignment which saw her form a union with fellow former NXT UK star Tegan Nox. In a side story running parallel to her title chase, the Nightmare teamed up with the girl with the shiniest wizard after they started a beef with Mandy Rose and Sonya Deville. While in real life, she was starting a relationship with fellow Australian performer and current House of Black member Buddy Murphy back in the ring in November of that year, she'd be right up there with Triple H when he led an NXT invasion onto the main roster in the lead up to Survivor Series. And when the game tasked her with showing everyone exactly why the Black and Gold brand was considered to have the best women's division in the Western world at the time, she would do just this. On the November 22nd episode of SmackDown, she'd defeat both Sasha Banks and Charlotte Flair in a triple threat match. But for as big of a moment as this represented for the former NXT UK Women's Champion, it still wasn't where her main focus lay. Because, with unfinished business still to be dealt with over at Full Sail University, she'd return there just in time for TakeOver War Games the following night. There, less than 24 hours after showing the main roster just what she was capable of, Ripley would remind NXT she was also the boss on her home base when she led her team to victory against Team Baszler, and it wouldn't be just anyone she pinned to get the win that night either. It would be the NXT Women's Champion herself, Shayna Baszler. So with a victory over the champ, the showdown between the two felt inevitable. But before that could take place, Ripley made one more return to the main roster. At November 24th's Survivor Series, she'd complete a very busy weekend by leading Team NXT to victory over Team Raw and Team SmackDown. Then it was time for the biggest moment of her career to date. On the December 18th episode of the Black and Gold brand, she'd main event by challenging the Queen of Spades for the top women's prize on the show. That's right, after 416 days, the Queen of Spades' time finally ran out after a war which closed out the show in spectacular fashion. Rhea was able to pin her and then be held up on the shoulders of the entire babyface roster as she was draped in her newly won title around her waist. Even if she had now conquered the mountain, it wasn't as if she could take her foot off the gas, because with her now firmly being given the ball to run with, the Adelaide native had to keep on at full speed. And this meant reigniting an old rivalry once more. At January 25th's Worlds Collide, a show which pitted the stars of NXT against the stars of NXT UK, Ripley and Toni Storm met yet again, this time with the US version of the women's title on the line. But what made this one such a challenge for the champ was that up until now, she'd never actually beaten her fellow Australian, and Storm was only too happy to bring up this fact in promos prior to the bout, all with the aim of getting in her opponent's head. In the end though, at Worlds Collide, after a battle which waged for just over 10 minutes, it would be the champ who came out on top as she finally slayed the dragon from her past. So the only question remaining after that was, who's next? Well, as it happened, it would be none other than Charlotte Flair. Still remembering the victory Ripley had scored over her and Sasha Banks a few months prior, she would use her win at the 2020 Women's Royal Rumble to challenge neither the Raw nor the SmackDown Women's Champion, but the NXT Women's Champion instead. It was a move which surprised everybody, but one which presented Rhea with a unique opportunity. Now, for the first time ever, the NXT Women's Championship would be defended at Wrestlemania. Unfortunately, by the time this one came around, outside circumstances would lead it to being the show which was infamously held in front of an empty performance center. And to make matters worse, not only would there be no fans in attendance, but the Nightmare would lose. But at least she'd get her rematch, right? Well, no. Following WrestleMania 36, visa issues saw Ripley have to return to Australia temporarily, and with progress being slow on account of the state of the world at the time, it meant she wouldn't be able to return to America until May 6, 2020, by which point a new challenger to the Queen's crown had risen in the form of Io Shirai. Rather than challenge Flair one-on-one at June 7th's TakeOver in Your House, Ripley would have to contend with both her and the Genius of the Sky in a triple threat match. And while the former champ gave it her best effort, in the end, it would be Io who came out of this one with the title around her waist. It was clear that her time on the developmental brand was coming to a natural end. After taking part in the Women's War Games match once more that November, then involving herself in a brief feud with Raquel Gonzalez at the start of 2021, the Nightmare finally made the jump over to the main roster full-time. On the March 22nd episode of Raw that year, she appeared and challenged Asuka to a bout for the Raw Women's Championship at WrestleMania 37. And there, finally exercising her demons from the year prior, Ripley was able to overcome the Empress of Tomorrow and win the top prize on the red brand to finally establish herself as a player going forward. Now, while she had managed to get the big victory on the grandest stage of them all, she still hadn't been able to beat the Queen. And so that was why her first big title defense the following month at WrestleMania Backlash felt so important, as it would pit the champ against both Asuka and Charlotte Flair. Rhea would pick up the win during this one too, firmly rooting herself as the top women's star on Raw in the process. That was until Money in the Bank on July 18th. There, Flair challenged her once more, and this time, much to the heartbreak of the Aussie star, she was able to beat her for the gold, ending her reign at 98 days. Even if she'd now lost her championship, the Nightmare wasn't going to stay down for long. After trying and ultimately failing to regain the Raw Women's title during a triple threat match between her, Flair, and Nikki ASH at that August SummerSlam, Ripley found out she had a lot in common with the Scottish almost superhero. After all, they'd both spent a lot of time on the indie scene prior to this. Following this, they decided to form a tag team and together go after the WWE Women's Tag Team titles. And with their combined might, it wasn't long before they'd earn a shot at these very championships when they went up against Natalya and Tamina on the September 20th episode of Raw. But would they be able to score the win here? Of course they would. And after dispatching the former champs, the team of Rhea and Nikki would go on a 63-day reign with their interbrand prizes. Sadly though, This run also ended in heartbreak. After losing the belts to Carmella and Queen Zelina in January of 2022, ASH would turn on her partner and jump to the side of the heels. Needing a new ally, the Nightmare began a pairing with Liv Morgan, which saw them challenge for the women's tag team titles at WrestleMania 38. When that attempt bore no fruit, this time it was Ripley's turn to shift allegiances, as she attacked her new partner and left her laying, becoming a full-blown heel for the first time since her days on NXT UK. This couldn't have come at a better time for the Australian, because after a strong start on the main roster in 2021, she'd begun to feel herself stalling and was growing increasingly frustrated with her spot on the card. But then, at WrestleMania Backlash on May 8th, she'd get her most high-profile role yet, when she helped Edge defeat AJ Styles, this marking her formal entry into the Judgment Day. After the Rated R superstar returned from retirement in 2020, he made it his mission to get some younger talent over, and that's why he'd started mentoring Damian Priest early on in 2022. While as a duo they were strong, it wasn't until the former Raw Women's Champion joined their ranks that they fully blossomed into the top heel act everyone knew it could be. It was also at this point that Rhea began altering her look to reflect her new darker alignment. Sure, she had been an edgy figure prior to this, but now dialing it up to 10, she'd fully morph into WWE's resident eradicator of the women's division. Even when Edge was kicked out of the Judgment Day and a new leader joined in the form of Finn Balor, Rhea Ripley barely batted an eyelash, because as far as she was concerned, no matter who was the public face of things, she was the real one in charge. And this only became clearer as 2022 went on. The Nightmare began acting as the primary force in recruiting Dominic Mysterio away from his family and into the heel faction. Initially though, Dominic turned down any such offers being made to him and continued to remain by his father's side. That was until September 3rd's Clash at the Castle, where after months of being wooed, he finally caved in and jumped to the other team so as to be with his mommy Rhea. What followed from there would be one of the most entertaining things the company had done in years, with the two now sharing an ambiguous relationship that at times felt more like master and servant than anything else. Dominic suddenly became entertaining after having spent years as a babyface. And while he deserves credit for this, a large part of what finally made it click for him was the fact that with Rhea by his side, it all just worked. With her dom-dom now being firmly established, Ripley has been able to refocus her attention on becoming the top player in the women's division once more. And how has she done this? Well, by beating everyone who's been put against her over the last few months. After winning the 2023 Women's Royal Rumble from the #1 spot, Rhea Ripley would go on to defeat Charlotte Flair at WrestleMania, in the defining moment of her career so far. Ever since this, she's been on top of the world, with her even being the #1 pick of Night 2 of the WWE Draft. There is truly no stopping the Eradicator. Maybe like Chyna before her, she'll even start branching off into the men's division and go after the Intercontinental Championship. Whatever she does, the possibilities are limitless, because at only 26 years old, she's arguably the best talent on the roster and is no doubt still years away from hitting her prime.